She was 20 and had just been told there was no place left for her under her uncle's roof. No parents, no inheritance, no plan. Only her father's brass compass and $11 folded into the lining of her coat. With that $11, she bought a paper claim to an abandoned mining camp above Granite Hollow, a place no one had walked into in 80 years. But what nobody knew was that the camp above the tree line held something that would change her life forever. Settle in, tell us where you're watching from, and stay close, because Margaret Cooper's story is only beginning. Margaret Cooper had been born in a 2-room cabin on the flats below Granite Hollow in the last week of a hard January to Ellen and Thomas Cooper, a schoolteacher and a prospector turned freighter who had met at a church picnic and married 3 months later without asking anyone's permission. Ellen died of a lung fever the winter Margaret was 6, and after that, it was only her father and the little cast-iron stove and the 2 chairs pulled close to it, while he read aloud to her from an almanac or a mining journal or, when there was nothing else, the labels on tinned goods. Thomas Cooper was not an educated man, but he had a prospector's patience and a freighter's steady hand, and he taught Margaret how to bank a fire, harness a mule, oil a hinge, and read the sky for the kind of weather that would strand a wagon between one town and the next. He carried a brass pocket compass on a leather thong, a heavy, plain instrument the size of a biscuit, engraved on the back with the initials TC and a small anchor his own father had scratched there during the war, and he let Margaret hold it whenever they stopped to eat. She learned north from that compass before she learned her letters. When he was killed in a shaft collapse at the Bluebell mine in the spring, she was 12. The foreman brought his body home in a wagon and put the compass into her hand along with his tobacco tin and a folded $12 draft the company was legally obliged to pay. The compass was warm from the foreman's pocket. Margaret did not cry in front of him. She did not cry that night. She wrapped the compass in a square of flannel and slept with it under her pillow, and she has slept that way every night for the 8 years since. There was no one else on her mother's side, and no one on her father's except a brother named Harold, who kept a general store in the town below Granite Hollow, and had a thin, unhappy wife named Louisa and no children of their own. They took Margaret in because there was nowhere else to send her, and they gave her a cot in the storeroom behind the counter, and they let her eat what was left after they had eaten, and in exchange she swept the store, weighed out flour, kept the ledger in her small, careful hand, and answered to whichever name Louisa happened to use. Girl or child, or in the worst of her moods, that one. Uncle Harold was not cruel, only tired, and he treated Margaret the way a man treats a fence he has inherited. He did not tear her down, but he did not paint her either. What saved her in those years was a widow named Hetty Barnes, who lived in a slouching cabin at the north edge of town and had been married once to the assayer at Bluebell and knew half the country by name. Hetty was 68, thin as a wire, and spoke only when speech was necessary. She had watched Thomas Cooper's daughter come and go from the store for a full year before she stopped Margaret on the road one afternoon and said, without preamble, "Come split wood for me on Sundays, and I'll teach you what your father didn't have time to." Margaret went the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and every Sunday for 7 years. Hetty taught her to swing an axe without wasting her back, to keep a wood stove holding coals through a 14-hour night, to mend leather with a saddler's stitch, to render tallow, to shoot a small .22 rifle at a tin can at 40 paces, to identify galena and pyrite and quartz shot through with the pale threads that meant silver, and to read a coming storm off the shoulder of the mountains an hour before it arrived. She taught Margaret to write a proper letter, to file a claim, and to read a mining record without flinching at the numbers. She taught her, above all, that a woman alone in this country was not helpless if she was willing to work and pay attention. In the storeroom at night, by the light of a single tallow candle set on an upturned crate, Margaret read whatever came into the store and did not sell. Almanacs, county registers, 2 years of a Denver newspaper that had come wrapped around a shipment of nails, a cracked copy of a mining engineer's handbook a drummer had left as part payment on a debt. She read it all twice, and in the county register for the year she was born she found, in a copperplate hand, an entry for a claim called the Sutter Ridge Camp, on the flank of the mountain above Granite Hollow, a silver lead operation of 41 men that had gone quiet in a single week in the autumn of 80 years past, and had never been reopened, and had never been legally reassigned. She underlined it with her thumbnail. She said nothing to her uncle. The next Sunday, she asked Hetty Barnes about the camp, and Hetty looked a long time over the rim of her tin cup and said, "Only, that country don't give a thing up easy, and don't take a thing back easy either. Remember that." Margaret remembered it. Hetty Barnes died in her sleep the winter Margaret turned 19. Margaret found her the next morning with the fire gone out and the cat curled on her chest, and she washed the body herself and dressed it and sat with it until the men came for it, and only then, alone in the cold cabin, did she allow herself to put her face against Hetty's folded quilt and weep. Hetty had left her nothing in writing. She had nothing to leave. But she had left Margaret her small .22 rifle, a tin box of assay slips, and a set of hand-forged fire tongs. And Margaret carried these back to her uncle's storeroom and set them on the shelf above her cot beside the flannel-wrapped compass. For the year that followed, Margaret worked harder than ever at the store, and she saved what small coins came her way in a jar under her cot, and she waited, though she could not have said for what. Louisa grew colder as Margaret grew older, perhaps because a niece at 20 is a different creature than a niece at 12. Perhaps because the store had begun to lose customers to a newer establishment 2 streets over, and Louisa needed someone to blame. She began locking the pantry at night. She began weighing the flour Margaret used for the morning biscuits. She began, in small, careful ways, to make it understood that Margaret was a mouth and not a hand. And Margaret, who had learned from Hetty Barnes to pay attention, understood. The ejection, when it came on a Tuesday in the second week of March, and it came without a raised voice. Margaret had been up since 4 to light the store stove and set the biscuits, and she was sweeping the plank floor between the flour barrels and the nail bins when Louisa came down the back stairs in her wrapper with a folded paper in her hand, and set it on the counter without looking at Margaret directly. Harold was already at the counter with his account book open, and he did not look up either, and the small brass bell above the door was still, and the room smelled of cold ash and molasses. And Margaret set the broom against the barrel and came forward and picked up the paper and read it. It was a note in Louisa's careful schoolgirl hand. It said that the storeroom was needed for goods, that a cot could no longer be spared, that the girl would need to make other arrangements by the end of the week, and that they wished her well. It was signed by Louisa and, below Louisa's name, by Harold, in Harold's slower and less certain hand. Margaret read the note twice. She folded it in half, and then in quarters, and set it back on the counter beside the account book. She said nothing. Harold turned a page in his book and did not lift his eyes, and Louisa went to the pantry with her ring of keys and did not turn around. And the small clock above the door ticked, and Margaret went back to sweeping until the floor between the flour barrels and the nail bins was clean. That night, she took the flannel bundle from under her pillow and unwrapped the compass and held it in her palm until it warmed. And she set it back and wrapped it again and slept, or lay with her eyes closed. until the first gray came in at the storeroom window. She had 4 days. She spent them settling what could be settled. She paid a boy 2 cents to carry a note to the county recorder's office, asking after the Sutter Ridge camp on the flank of the mountain above Granite Hollow. The clerk sent word back that the claim was open, that no fee had been paid on it in 80 years, that under the statute it could be taken up by any adult who filed and paid the standing charge of $11, and that a paper would be issued for that sum and no other. Margaret took the coins from the jar under her cot and counted them on the blanket. There were $11.40. She kept the 40 cents. She walked to the recorder's office on the Friday morning in a wind that carried grit off the flats, and she paid the $11 in a stack of small coins, and she signed the paper with her full name, Margaret Ellen Cooper, in the careful copperplate Hetty Barnes had taught her, and the clerk stamped it and handed it across the counter without ceremony and told her good luck. And she folded the paper into the lining of her coat beside the compass and went back to the store and finished her shift. She left before dawn on the Sunday, because leaving before dawn is easier than leaving in daylight, and because she did not want to be seen. She wore her father's canvas coat with the compass and the paper claim sewn into the lining, and Hetty's small .22 rifle across her back on a length of harness leather, and she carried a rolled wool blanket, a tin cup, a folding knife, a bag of oats and a bag of dried apples, and a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, a box of matches wrapped again in oilcloth. The fire tongs lashed to the outside of the roll, the tobacco tin holding her 40 cents and a spool of waxed thread and a paper of needles and the flannel quilt Hetty had left folded on the bed. She did not leave a note. She closed the storeroom door behind her and set the key on the counter and walked out into the black street. The town was quiet under a hard frost, and her breath went ahead of her in pale plumes, and the dog at the Smiths did not bother to bark. She turned north at the last house and took the wagon track that climbed toward the timber, and she did not look back at the roof of the store or at the single lit window of Louisa's kitchen, where Louisa had already begun to boil water for tea. By the time the first gray came up behind the ridge, Margaret was 2 miles above the town and climbing into the pines. The country began to change under her feet almost at once. The wagon track narrowed to a pack trail and then to a game trail, and the pines thickened and closed overhead until the sky was a broken ribbon between the tops of the trees, and the ground went from frozen mud to hard-packed old snow with a crust that took her weight in some places and broke through it in others. She stopped at midday beside a creek that ran black under a ceiling of ice, and knelt and broke a hole with the butt of the rifle, and drank from her tin cup, and she ate a piece of the cheese and 2 of the dried apples, and folded the cloth back around what remained. She checked the compass. She was walking a little east of north, which was correct. She went on. The trail climbed. By afternoon, the pines began to thin and give way to spruce, and the spruce to a scatter of dwarfed and wind-twisted things that were hardly trees at all, and beyond them, the timberline showed as a clean gray edge where the mountain refused any further green. Margaret came out of the last stand of stunted spruce in the low sun, and stood at the edge of the open slope and looked up, and the mountain went on above her in bare rock and old snow, streaked with the long blue shadows of late afternoon, and the wind came down off it in a steady cold pressure that pushed her coat against her ribs. Somewhere on that slope, folded into a cirque she could not yet see, was the Sutter Ridge camp. She could not reach it before dark. She turned aside into the last of the spruce and found a place where 3 trees leaned together and made a rough shelter of their trunks, and she cleared the snow to bare needles with the edge of her boot and gathered dead wood, and she struck a match and coaxed a small fire with shavings from a dry branch, and fed it slowly the way Hetty had taught her, and she sat close to it with the flannel quilt over her shoulders and the rifle across her lap, and ate the second piece of cheese and drank hot water from the tin cup. And she watched the sky go from gray to violet to a hard black scattered with stars so bright and so many that they seemed to press downward on the ridge. She slept in short pieces, waking to feed the fire, and each time she woke, she took the compass out and held it, not to read it, but only to hold it. And each time she put it back and slept again. And the wind came off the mountain all night and did not stop. At the first gray of morning, she banked the coals under a shovel of snow and shouldered her roll and climbed out of the trees onto the open slope. The wind had thinned in the night, and the sky above the ridge was a clean, pale blue that hurt to look at. She climbed for 2 hours, following the compass a little east of north across a long field of wind-scoured snow and broken slate, and at the top of a rise she stopped and saw the camp below her in the bowl of the cirque. It sat where it had been left. 7 buildings and 1 head frame stood in a rough half-circle around a flat of packed gravel and old tailings, all of it gray and silver in the low sun, and cased in a rime of frost that had not thawed in 80 winters. The largest building was a long, low cookhouse of squared logs, with a shake roof sagged in the middle under the weight of the snows. Beyond it stood 2 bunkhouses set end to end, one of logs and one of milled plank, both with their doors shut. To the east of these was an assay office no larger than a spring house, built of stone laid without mortar and chinked with clay. West of the cookhouse stood a blacksmith's shed of upright poles and a low roof, open on the downhill side, and beside it a plank shed she took for the powder magazine. Above them all rose the head frame over the shaft, a spare 4-legged tower of peeled timbers still standing straight, with the ore bucket hung in it on a rusted cable, and the winch drum below wound with a coil of hemp rope gone black. Margaret came down into the camp slowly, watching the ground. Snow lay in long drifts between the buildings, but the wind had scoured the doorsteps clean, and she saw on the packed gravel the faint print of a pickaxe head where someone had set it down and never picked it up. A wheelbarrow stood upside down against the cookhouse wall. A pair of leather boots stood beside the bunkhouse door, laces still tied, the leather gray and hard as slate. A stack of stove wood was piled neatly under the cookhouse eave, split and dry, enough for a week of fires. On a plank bench beside the assay office door sat a coffee tin with the lid gone and a wooden spoon in it, and inside the tin a hard black ring of coffee grounds left where the last cup had been poured out. She stood a long moment in the middle of the flat and understood that no one had come here after they left. The camp had not been carried out of. It had been walked out of. She could see it in the boots and the barrow and the tin, and in the way the pickaxe had been set down with the head to the ground and never picked up again. She went first to the cookhouse. The door was oak, 3 inches thick, hung on wrought iron strap hinges, held shut by a wooden latch that lifted with a leather cord, and the cord had rotted to a stub. She worked the latch with the tip of her knife and pushed the door, and it opened inward on air that was colder than the outside air and smelled of wood smoke and old flour and iron. Inside were 2 long trestle tables set with tin plates and tin cups, a bench along each side, 41 places counted at a glance, and at the far end a cast-iron cook-stove of a make she had seen once in the mining engineer's handbook, 6 feet long, with 2 ovens and a warming shelf and a black kettle set on the back burner. In the kettle was a solid disk of ice. On the warming shelf lay a ladle, a folded flour sack, and a set of tongs. On the wall behind the stove hung an apron on a nail. Everything sat as though the cook had stepped out to speak to a man at the door and had not come back. Margaret set her roll on the nearest bench and stood in the middle of the cookhouse and did what Hetty had taught her, which was to look before she touched. She counted the windows, 3, all shuttered from the inside, counted the doors, 2, front and back, counted the lamps, 4, hung from wire on the ceiling beams, their wicks intact, and the oil in their reservoirs frozen to a yellow wax. She walked the length of the room once, and then a second time, and on the second pass she stopped beside the stove. The stove sat on a hearth of flat river stones laid without mortar, and one of the stones at the front corner sat a hare proud of the others. She had marked it on the first pass without knowing why. She knelt and set her palm on it, and rocked it and felt it move against the stones beside it. She worked the tip of her knife into the seam and lifted the stone and set it aside on the floorboards. Beneath it was a shallow pit lined with a piece of oiled canvas, and folded into the canvas was a tin box the size of a Bible. She lifted the box out and set it on the floor and untied the twine that held it shut. Inside, wrapped in a second square of oiled canvas, was a bundle of paper currency in old brown notes, a small canvas sack that held coin, and a folded letter written in careful pencil on a single sheet of ledger paper. She unfolded the notes and counted them by the light from the open door. $84 in notes, and in the sack a further $22.11 in silver, and laid beside these a plain gold wedding band, worn thin, and a tintype the size of her palm of a young woman in a dark dress holding a baby on her lap. Margaret set the money and the ring and the picture on the canvas in a careful row, and took up the letter and held it toward the light of the door, and she read it slowly, once through, and then again. "Whoever finds this," the letter began, "my name is Peter Halverson, and I have cooked for the men of the Sutter Ridge camp for 11 years. I was born in Norway, and I came to this country at 19. I had a wife named Anna and a daughter named Ingrid. Anna died of a fever the year Ingrid was 2, and Ingrid was raised by my wife's sister in a town I have not seen since. I have sent money every month for 16 years, and I have not been answered in 6, and I believe now she does not know who I am. I am 58, and my chest is bad, and I do not expect to leave this camp on my feet. What is under this stone is what I have saved and what I meant for her. If you are reading this, the camp is gone or I am gone or both, and it is no use to her now. Take what is here and use it well. Do not try to send it after Ingrid. She has her life. I hope you have come to this place because you needed a place to come to, and I hope the stove draws for you the way it drew for me. Bank the fire slow. The chimney runs true. Peter Halverson, cook." Margaret refolded the letter along its old creases and set it on top of the tin box and sat for a while on the bench with her hands flat on her knees. Then she stood and did what needed doing. She took the ladle down from the warming shelf, chipped the disk of ice out of the kettle with the butt of her knife, and carried it out to melt in a pan of clean snow. She brought in an armload of the split stove wood from under the eave, and she opened the firebox and swept out 80 years of dust and a mouse's nest with the folded flour sack, and she laid a small fire the way Hetty had taught her, with shavings from a dry stick under a cross of kindling under 2 split lengths of pine. She struck a match and held it to the shavings and closed the door halfway and waited. The chimney drew clean on the first breath. The smoke went up and did not come back, and Peter Halverson's line about the chimney was proved true in the first minute of her occupancy. Over the next 11 days, she made the cookhouse habitable and left the other buildings shut. She swept the plank floor, took down the 4 ceiling lamps, thawed the oil over the stove, trimmed the wicks with her folding knife, and set 2 of them burning on the trestle table. She unbolted the shutters from the inside and let in the flat white light off the snow. She washed the tin plates and cups in melted snow water heated on the stove and stacked them on a shelf. She took the apron off its nail and washed it and hung it back up. She laid Hetty's flannel quilt on the bench nearest the stove and slept there with the rifle within arm's reach and the compass under the folded coat that served as her pillow. On the 12th morning, she walked back down to Granite Hollow with the paper claim in her pocket and $12 in Peter Halverson's silver in the tobacco tin, and she began the second kind of work. She filed the claim a second time at the recorder's office with the current year's fee paid in coin, and the clerk wrote her name in the standing ledger in his own hand. Margaret Ellen Cooper, Sutter Ridge, filed and paid. She did not stop at her uncle's store. She went instead to the yard behind the livery and hired a packer named Ott Sundgren, 51, a Swede with a broken front tooth and a good gray mule, to carry a load of goods up the pack trail to the timberline in exchange for $4 and a written promise of $4 more on his return trip in April. Ott Sundgren looked at her a long moment across the mule's back and said only, "You are Thomas Cooper's girl." And Margaret said she was, and the thing between them was settled without further speech. She bought at the feed store 4 sacks of oats, 2 sacks of beans, a sack of coarse flour, a sack of salt, a small keg of lard, a tin of coffee, a tin of baking soda, a coil of new hemp rope, a box of number 6 nails, a box of number 10 nails, a can of lamp oil, a bar of yellow soap, and a 2-pound roll of oakum for chinking. She paid in Peter Halverson's brown notes and took her receipts. At the hardware she bought a felling axe, a buck saw with 2 spare blades, a hand drill and a set of bits, a small anvil weighing 30 pounds, and a pair of leather gloves that fit. The storekeeper was a widower named August Riley, 60, who had known her father, and when he tallied her bill, he took off $1.20 without comment and wrote "paid" across it in pencil. She hired, in the same afternoon, a carpenter named Wendell Poe, 34, quiet, missing 2 fingers of his left hand from a mill accident, to come up with Ott's second load and help her reset the sagging ridgepole of the cookhouse roof. She hired a woman named Rosalind Meeker, 44, a widow who kept goats on the flats, to teach her to milk and to sell her 2 young nannies in the spring, payable half in coin and half in silver ore when she had proved the shaft. Rosalind Meeker looked at the paper claim, looked at Margaret, and said, "You'll want a dog," and the next morning sent up with Ott a half-grown black shepherd bitch called Juno, thrown in for nothing. Wendell Poe came up in the last week of March and stayed 6 days. He and Margaret jacked the sagged ridgepole with a pair of stout spruce props cut from the timberline, sistered a new beam of green fir alongside the old one, drove the number 10 nails in a staggered pattern the way he showed her, and reshingled the low place with shakes split from a block of straight-grained cedar Ott had freighted up on the second trip. Margaret worked the froe under Wendell's eye until she could split a clean shake in 3 strokes, and Wendell said nothing about her being a woman or being 20, and only corrected her grip on the mallet once. When he left, he took $6 in Peter Halverson's notes and a jar of the coffee, and would take no more. By the first week of May, the snow had gone off the flat of the camp, and the cookhouse stood tight and dry with a straight ridge and a swept floor and a stove that drew clean morning and night. Margaret opened the assay office next, and then the smaller of the 2 bunkhouses, and she moved her bed into a corner room of the bunkhouse, and kept the cookhouse for cooking and for company. She washed Peter Halverson's tintype in a shallow pan of warm water, dried it on a clean cloth, and set it on the shelf above the stove between the brass compass and the tin box of Hetty's assay slips. Word went down the mountain the way word does. Ott Sundgren told the livery, The livery told the feed store told the church, and by June a small, steady traffic had begun up the pack trail to the Sutter Ridge camp. Rosalind Meeker came up in June with the 2 young nannies and a wheel of goat cheese, and stayed 2 nights and taught Margaret to milk left-handed against the goat's flank the way it was done. August Riley sent up a second-hand cast-iron skillet as a house gift and would not be paid for it. A surveyor named Merritt Doyle, 39, came up on his own account, walked the shaft head with Margaret, examined the timbers, examined a sample she had knocked off the vein with a handpick, and wrote her out an unsigned assay note that read, in his neat hand, Galena, silver-bearing, workable at small scale by one hand, with care. He would take no fee and asked only for a hot dinner and a bed on the bench by the stove. Margaret began to keep a ledger of her own, in the copperplate Hetty had taught her, on the blank back pages of Peter Halverson's old kitchen book. She wrote down every pound of ore she pulled from the shallow drift by hand, every dollar spent, every debt owed and paid. She paid Ott his second $4 on the day he brought up her stovepipe, and she paid Wendell Poe another $2 when he came back in July to hang a new door on the assay office. She sold her first small parcel of hand-sorted ore in August, 22 pounds at the buying office in Granite Hollow, for $9.40, and she wrote the amount in the ledger and underlined it once with her thumbnail the way she had underlined the county register 8 years before. By the first snow of the second autumn, the camp was known in the country below by her name. People said the Cooper Camp, not Sutter Ridge, and it was said without argument. The pack trail she had come up on alone was now beaten smooth by mules and by boots, and there was a rough plank sign at the last switchback that Wendell Poe had cut and burned with a hot iron that read simply, Cooper, 1 mile, with an arrow. Ott Sundgren came up on the 15th of every month with mail and salt and news, and stayed for a bowl of Margaret's bean and mutton soup at the trestle table, and left again before dark. Rosalind Meeker came up in the last week of every month with a wheel of cheese and took back a tin of ore and a written receipt. August Riley's boy, Toby Riley, 13, was sent up on Saturdays through the summer to help split wood, and was paid a nickel a day and fed twice, and he stopped calling her ma'am after the 3rd Saturday and called her Margaret after that. Small rituals formed. The lamp above the trestle table was lit at first gray and put out at full dark. The kettle on the back burner was never empty. Peter Halverson's tintype was dusted every Sunday with the corner of the flannel sack. Juno slept on a folded blanket at the foot of the stove, and rose when Margaret rose. On the last Sunday of every month, Margaret walked down to Granite Hollow and sat 2 hours in Hetty Barnes's cabin, which no one had taken, and swept the floor and left again. She did not go into her uncle's store. Louisa saw her once from the pantry window and turned away, and Harold saw her once from the counter and lifted his hand a bare inch and let it fall, and neither thing was spoken of after. On an evening in the 3rd winter, with the flat of the camp under fresh snow and the wind gone still for the first time in a week, Margaret sat on the bench nearest the stove in the cookhouse, with the ledger open on her knee and the lamp above the trestle table burning steady. Juno lay on the folded blanket at her feet. The kettle ticked on the back burner. On the shelf above the stove stood 3 things in a row: the brass pocket compass her father Thomas Cooper had carried on a leather thong, engraved on the back with the initials T.C., and the small anchor scratched by his own father in the war. The palm-sized tintype of the young woman in the dark dress holding the baby on her lap, which Peter Halverson had folded into oiled canvas and hidden under the front corner stone of the hearth 80 years before. And between them the plain gold wedding band, worn thin, which had been Anna Halverson's and which Margaret had never put on and never intended to. 2 objects from 2 strangers who had both loved a child they never got to see grown. Margaret had understood the arrangement of them the first time she set them there, and had not moved them since. She closed the ledger. The entries for the year were in Hetty Barnes's careful copperplate, in Margaret's hand. $58 owed and paid, $112 taken in ore, $4 to Ott, $2 to Wendell, a nickel a Saturday to Toby Riley, a wheel of cheese to Rosalind, coffee to August Riley for the skillet he would not be paid for. She thought about the note Louisa had set on the counter that Tuesday in March, folded and signed in her careful schoolgirl hand, and about Harold turning a page in his account book and not looking up, and about the $11 in small coins she had counted out to the clerk in the recorder's office, and about the boy who had carried her note for 2 cents. She thought about Hetty's Sunday kitchen and the .22 rifle above the door and the tin cup of thin coffee and the sentence that the country does not give a thing up easy and does not take a thing back easy either. She had remembered it. She had also learned the second half of it, which Hetty had not said and had perhaps not needed to, that a thing given up by others could sometimes be taken up by one who was willing to walk to it in the cold. Juno lifted her head, listened, and put it down again. The stove drew clean. The chimney ran true, as Peter Halverson had written. Margaret banked the fire slow, as he had said to, and set the ledger on the shelf below the compass and the tintype and the ring, and blew out the lamp. Margaret Cooper was 20, and she had been put out of a storeroom behind a counter with a folded note and a ring of keys. She had $11 sewn into the lining of her father's canvas coat and a brass compass wrapped in flannel. And she had spent the $11 on a paper claim to a mining camp above Granite Hollow that no one had walked into in 80 years. It was the best $11 she ever spent. If this story reached you tonight, leave a small mark below to say where you're watching from, and share it with one person who is standing in the cold of their own beginning. And ask yourself quietly, what have others walked away from that was only waiting for you to walk toward it? She was 18 years old and turned out of the only home she had ever known, with no family left to claim her and no money to speak of, just a battered brass compass that had belonged to her uncle and $11 folded into the lining of her coat. With that $11, she bought a sway-backed mule and a week of hardtack and set out across the flats toward Coyote Ridge, because there was nowhere else in the world she had any right to go. But what nobody knew, not the townsfolk who watched her ride out, not the men who had signed her away, was that somewhere between the salt pan and the ridge lay the missing supply convoy that half the territory had been searching for, and that Alice Fletcher would be the first living soul to find it, and that its wagons were carrying something that would change her life forever. Settle in and stay close, and before we go any further, let us know down in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Alice Fletcher had been born in a 2-room adobe on the north edge of a mining town called Bracken Wells, the only child of a freight hauler named Thomas Fletcher and a schoolteacher named Ruth, and for the first 11 years of her life she had believed, without ever needing to say so, that the small, warm world of her family was the shape the whole world took. Her father drove ore wagons between the stamp mill and the rail line at Ash Fork, and he was gone often, and when he came home he smelled of axle grease and creosote, and he would sit her on his knee and let her turn the pages of the freight ledger while he read out the numbers. Her mother taught the town's children in a whitewashed schoolhouse behind the church, and she taught Alice at the kitchen table in the evenings, arithmetic and penmanship and the names of the plants that grew along the arroyo. And she had a way of laughing that made Alice feel she had done something clever, even when she had only asked a question. The fever came through in the spring of Alice's 11th year, and it took her mother in 5 days and her father in 9. And when it was over, Alice was standing in the yard in a dress that no longer fit her, watching two men from the burial society roll a barrow toward the wagon track, and there was no one left in the adobe but her. She was taken in that same week by her father's older brother, a wagon master named Reuben Fletcher, who had never married and who lived alone in a plank house at the edge of a stage stop called Dry Bend, 40 miles south. Reuben was a tall, stooped man with a gray mustache and hands that had been broken and set more than once, and he did not know what to do with a grieving child, and so he did the only thing he knew how to do, which was to teach her the work of his hands. For 7 years he taught her, patiently and without much speech, and she learned. She learned to grease a hub and reset a felloe and shoe a mule that did not want to be shod. She learned to read the sky for weather and the ground for tracks and the ears of a team for what the team was thinking. She learned the names and prices of every article a freight wagon might carry between El Paso and the Colorado line, and she learned the honest weight of a barrel by the sound it made when you rapped it, and she learned the dishonest tricks that a bad driver used to shave a load. Reuben carried in the breast pocket of his coat a brass pocket compass with a chipped glass and a needle that swung true, given to him by a trail scout he had ridden with as a young man. And when Alice was 15, he pressed it into her palm one evening at the supper table and closed her fingers around it and said only, "You'll want to know which way is north." And after that, the compass was hers. He died in the fall of her 18th year, quietly, in the chair by the stove, with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, and Alice buried him herself on the rise behind the plank house because there was no one else to do it. She had believed, in the flat childlike way one believes things when there is no reason yet to know better, that the plank house and the small paddock and the mule shed and the little bit of money Reuben kept in a tobacco tin under the floorboards would come to her, because she was the only kin he had left in the world, and because she had done the work of a grown hand for 3 years without complaint. She was wrong about this, as it turned out. In the particular administrative way that the world reserves for young women who have not learned yet to ask for anything in writing, Reuben had left no will. His half-brother from a first marriage nobody in Dry Bend had ever met arrived from Santa Fe on the 4th day after the burial. A soft man in a black coat named Marcus Holloway, with a lawyer's paper folded in his breast pocket and a look on his face that suggested he had already counted the rooms. He was polite to her. That was the part she would remember later, sitting on the mule with the compass in her coat and the flats opening out before her. How polite he had been. He had offered her a cup of her own coffee in her own kitchen, and he had explained, in the slow, careful voice a man uses with a horse he is not sure of, that the property and the stock and the tobacco tin under the floorboards were now, by law and by blood, his. He had offered her a week to gather her things. He had offered her, when the week was up, $11 for the mule she had raised from a foal, and he had counted the coins out onto the table one by one, and she had watched them stack, and she had not argued, because Reuben had taught her without ever saying so, that a person who argues from a losing position only teaches the winner how much they have lost. She had signed the paper he slid across the table with the same steady hand she used to sign a bill of lading, and she had thanked him for the coffee which was hers, and she had gone out to the paddock in the last of the afternoon light to begin the business of leaving. There was not, in the end, much to gather. Reuben had lived plainly, and she had lived more plainly still. She folded her second dress and her one good shirt into a flour sack. She rolled the wool blanket from her cot and tied it with a length of harness twine. She took the tin cup and the tin plate and the horn-handled knife she had used every day of her life at Dry Bend, and she took the small whetstone Reuben had kept by the stove, and she took a coil of picket rope and a hoof pick and a farrier's rasp with a worn wooden grip, because these were her tools and Marcus Holloway did not know their names. She took the brass compass out of the drawer where she had put it after the burial and slid it into the inner pocket of her coat, and she felt its weight settle there against her ribs like a second heart. She left the tobacco tin under the floorboards because the paper she had signed said it was not hers, and she was not a thief, though she thought about it for a long minute standing over the loose board with her boot on it. She fed the mule an extra measure of corn that evening and slept in the tack room on a folded saddle blanket, because Marcus Holloway had already moved his valise into the room that had been hers for 7 years and shut the door. In the morning, she was up before the light. She saddled the sway-backed mule herself, and she cinched the flour sack and the blanket roll behind the cantle, and she tied on a canvas water bag she had traded a spare bridle for at the stage stop the day before. She counted her coins in the gray dark of the yard. $11, the price of a mule she had raised from a foal, the whole of her fortune, folded into the lining of her coat where the stitching had come loose and could be pushed back closed with a thumb. Marcus Holloway came out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves as she was leading the mule through the gate. He said her name once, not unkindly. He asked her where she meant to go. She told him Coyote Ridge, because it was the only place west of Dry Bend she had ever heard Reuben speak of without cursing, and because a person asked such a question by a person like Marcus Holloway ought to have an answer ready. He nodded as though the answer satisfied some private list in his head, and he wished her luck, and he went back inside and shut the door. She did not look back at the plank house. She had already done her looking in the tack room in the dark, and she did not intend to spend any more of her strength on a building that no longer belonged to her. The flats west of Dry Bend ran for 2 full days before they broke against the first low shoulders of the Coyote Ridge country, and Alice Fletcher rode them at the walk because the mule was old and the sun was already thinking about being cruel by mid-morning. The land out there was the color of old bone, and it was flatter than any table, and the only things that stood above the level of a man's knee were the greasewood and the crooked stumps of yucca and once the bleached rib cage of a cow that had died walking. She rode with her hat pulled low and her collar turned up against the grit, and she watched the ground the way Reuben had taught her to watch it, reading the tracks of jackrabbit and coyote and the long straight prints of a pronghorn that had crossed her line before dawn. She stopped at mid-morning to let the mule blow, and she chewed a corner of hardtack softened in her mouth, and she stopped again at noon in the thin shade of a leaning ocotillo, and she poured a palmful of water into the crown of her hat and let the mule drink from it, because a mule that will not drink is a mule that will not walk, and a mule that will not walk in country like this is a mule that will kill you. By the second afternoon, the wind had come up out of the southwest, and it carried the smell of alkali dust and something sharper underneath it, mineral and faintly sweet, that she could not name. Her lips had split at the corners, and her knees ached from the long day in the saddle, and her shoulders had gone stiff from holding the reins one-handed against the pull of the wind. She thought, once, of Reuben in the chair by the stove with the coffee gone cold in his hand. And she thought of her mother at the kitchen table with the primer open between them. And she thought of her father with his big freighter's hands lifting her onto the seat of an ore wagon when she was small enough to fit inside his coat. And she did not cry. Because crying used water she did not have to spare, and because she had learned long ago that grief was a thing you carried the way you carried a load, distributed evenly and lashed down tight so it would not shift on the grade. The ridge came up on the western horizon in the last hour of the second day, a low blue smear against the paling sky, and she pointed the mule's nose at the highest notch of it and let him find his own pace. She camped that night in the lee of a lava outcrop with the mule picketed at the end of the rope and the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and she took out the brass compass and opened it in the last of the firelight and watched the needle settle north. and she thought that a needle that swung true was a small enough thing to be grateful for at the end of a hard day. And she closed the case and put it back against her ribs and slept. She woke before the light with the taste of salt on her teeth and the same faint, sweet smell in the air, stronger now that the wind had settled. She rolled her blanket, cinched the flour sack behind the cantle, and drank 2 swallows from the water bag and gave the mule 2 more. And then she rode. The land west of the lava outcrop began to break into shallow washes and low hump-backed ridges of caliche, and the sweet mineral smell rode the draws like water finding its own channel. And she followed it because Reuben had taught her that a smell on the wind will always lead you to its source if you are willing to be patient about it. By mid-morning, she had come to the lip of a dry wash wider than any she had crossed, its bed pale and hard, and she pulled the mule up short and sat very still in the saddle and looked down. There were wagons in the wash. She counted 6 of them, drawn up in the broken line of a convoy that had tried to circle and had not finished the circle. 3 abreast and 3 trailing, canvas bonnets bleached the color of bone and torn along their ridgepoles, tongues down in the dust. Wheels canted where the sand had worked around the felloes. The lead wagon lay on its side with a rear axle snapped clean and one wheel gone entirely from the hub. The tailboard of another had been pried open and left hanging on a single strap of leather. There were no mules in the traces. There were no mules anywhere. Where a team should have stood there were only scattered bones and pieces of cut harness laid out in the dust, as though a careful man had gone down the picket line with a knife. She rode down into the wash slowly, one hand on the mule's neck, and dismounted at the tail of the lead wagon and tied the mule to a spoke and stood a long while listening for anything alive. And there was nothing. Only the wind pulling at the ragged canvas and a sound like paper turning in an empty room. 3 men lay in the shade of the wagons. One was still in his coat and had a canteen strapped across his chest, empty, and the second had crawled some distance and lay face down with his arms folded under his head as if he had lain down to rest. The third was only bones and a hat. She had seen dead men before, though not so many at once, and she did what Reuben would have done, which was to take off her own hat for a moment and put it back on and go about the necessary work of understanding. The freight was Studebaker built, red paint sun-bled to the color of old brick, iron tires still sound. She counted the barrels she could see through the torn canvas. Flour, coarse ground meal, a keg of molasses split at the seam and long since crusted over, a sack of dried beans burst and half emptied by rats and birds. Ordinary provisions. But behind the flour barrels in the second wagon and stacked tight in the third and the fourth were small square crates of a size she had never seen on any freight bill, banded with iron and stenciled only with numbers. No consignee, no destination, no weight declared. She laid her hand on the top of one, and it was heavier than any crate of dry goods had a right to be. And the sweet mineral smell was thicker here, and she understood that the smell was not from anything the convoy had been said to carry. She got down her farrier's rasp and her horn-handled knife and set to work on the nearest crate with the patience Reuben had taught her, which was the patience of a person who means to open a thing without ruining what is inside. The iron bands she pried up one nail at a time, saving each nail in the crown of her hat, and the pine boards she worked loose along the grain because green pine will split if you hurry it. When the lid came up, she set it aside and folded back a layer of oiled canvas and stopped. Inside the crate, packed in sawdust and wrapped each in its own square of waxed paper, were ingots of silver, dull gray along the edges and bright where a corner had rubbed, stamped along the top with a die she did not recognize. She counted 20 ingots in the one crate. She counted 12 crates in the second wagon and 8 in the third, and could not see clearly into the fourth. She sat back on her heels in the shade of the torn canvas, and did not touch the silver for a long minute, because she had been raised by 2 careful people, and then by a third, and none of them had ever taught her to grab. Then she got up and went to the lead wagon, where the driver in the coat lay, and she looked for what a wagon master would have carried. And under the buckboard seat, behind a false panel of thin plank that had been slid crooked in some last hurried motion, she found a flat tin box and a canvas satchel wrapped in oilcloth, and she carried them out into the light. The tin box held gold coin, double eagles stacked in paper rolls, more money than she had known existed in one place. The satchel held a folded waybill, a small leather-bound book, a horn-handled pocket knife with a bone inlay worn smooth, and a letter 4 pages long, written in a slow, careful hand on the ruled paper of a freighter's ledger, and folded once and addressed on the outside in pencil to whoever finds this. She sat down against the wheel of the lead wagon in the strip of shade and opened the letter and read, "My name is Amos Kettleman, and I have been a wagon master on the southern freight roads for 26 years, and if you are reading this, then I did not come through, and the wagons did not either. I am writing this on the second night out of Fort Purgatory, with the fire low and the men asleep, because I have hauled a great many loads in my life, but I have never hauled one I liked less than this one. And a man who does not like his load ought to write down what he knows in case the load turns out to be the last of him. The crates in the second wagon and the third and the fourth are silver bullion belonging to no company that will admit to owning it, being the private stake of certain men in the Territorial House who mean to have it out of reach before the audit next spring. And the gold in the tin under my seat is my own honest wage of 11 years put by, against my sister's girl who is 8 this fall and has nobody else. If you are the one that finds us, take the gold first, because it is mine to give and I give it, and take of the silver what you have need of and no more. And get word by any decent hand to a man named Josiah Blake at the assay office in Coyote Ridge, who is a friend and will know what to do with the rest, and will see that the girl gets her share. I rode with a freighter out of Bracken Wells years ago by the name of Thomas Fletcher, who was as straight a man as ever set a break, and if any of his people are still living in that country, you might ask after them. For his sort is the sort I would trust with this. I am tired tonight, and the wind is up. I hope whoever you are, you made it here in better shape than we did. And I hope you go home from here, wherever home is for you. Amos Kettleman, Wagon Master, 2nd of October. Alice Fletcher read the letter through once, and then she read it through again. And when she came the second time to the name Thomas Fletcher, written in the slow, careful hand of a man she had never met, she put the pages down flat on her knee and pressed her palm against them and sat for a long time without moving, while the wind pulled at the torn canvas above her head and the sweet mineral smell of the silver rose up out of the open crate beside her, and she understood, without any drama at all, that the wash and the wagons and the crates and the tin box and the letter had been waiting. In the way that certain things wait, for the one person in the territory who would know what to do with them. She folded the letter along its old crease and slid it back inside the oilcloth with the leather-bound book and the horn-handled knife, and she took up the tin box of double eagles and weighed it once in her hand, and she took 4 ingots of silver out of the open crate and no more, and she wrapped the 4 ingots in a torn strip of wagon canvas and lashed the bundle behind her cantle along with the tin box and the satchel. She closed the crate and set the iron bands back in their grooves and pressed the saved nails home with the flat of the rasp, so that a man riding past at a distance would see only what he had seen before, which was 6 broken wagons in a wash. She covered the 3 dead men as well as she could with strips of the torn bonnet canvas and weighed the corners with stones. and she said over each of them the plain words her mother had said over a neighbor's grave once, which was that the ground was patient, and the wind was kind, and the rest was not for her to know. Then she watered the mule from the split molasses keg, which he would not touch, and from her own bag, which he drank slowly, and she rode out of the wash toward the notch in Coyote Ridge with the sun already low. She reached the town at mid-morning of the following day. Coyote Ridge was a single street of adobe and plank, with a livery at one end and a church without a bell at the other, and the assay office stood between them under a tin awning gone the color of a nickel. Josiah Blake was a small, square-shouldered man of about 60, with white eyebrows and ink on the fingers of his right hand. And when Alice Fletcher laid the letter open on his counter and set the horn-handled knife beside it, he read the 4 pages without speaking, and then he sat down on his stool and took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose and said only, "So he is dead then?" And Alice Fletcher said, "Yes, sir, in a wash 2 days east." Josiah Blake locked the office and took her to the back room, where he weighed the 4 ingots on his beam scale and wrote the weights into a private ledger under a heading he printed neatly with his pen, which read, "Kettleman Trust," and he counted the double eagles in the tin box aloud with her. And there were 311 of them, which was to say $6,220 in gold, saved 11 years by a man for a girl of 8. Josiah Blake said the girl's name was Ellen, and she lived in Fort Purgatory with a widowed aunt, and he would ride himself with a witness to carry her share, and he asked Alice Fletcher what she meant to do. She said she meant to send word to the marshal about the wagons and the dead, and she meant to take honest wages for the finding and the carrying and no more. Josiah Blake looked at her a long moment and said that was well spoken, and he counted out $100 in coin from the Kettleman gold as a finder's wage and wrote it into the ledger under her name, which he asked her to spell for him, and she did. That afternoon she stood in the marshal's office and told her account plainly to a man named Deputy Hollis Reed, who was 34 and had been 6 years in the badge, and he wrote her words down in a bound book and signed the bottom and asked her to sign under his name, which she did with the same steady hand that had signed the paper at Reuben's table. By the next day, it was known in Coyote Ridge that the girl who had come in on a sway-backed mule had found the lost convoy, and by the day after that, it was known that she had brought in the wagon master's private savings for a child in Fort Purgatory and had asked for only a finder's wage. Josiah Blake rode out with Deputy Hollis Reed and 4 men in a borrowed freight wagon to bring back the silver and the bones, and when they returned 5 days later, the silver went into the vault of the assay office under seal, and the ingots were counted publicly on the boardwalk in the presence of the marshal, and the tally was 160 crates of 20 ingots each, a sum that made grown men take off their hats without knowing why. The Territorial House never claimed a bar of it, because no man among them could claim it without ruining himself. And in the spring an inquiry was held in Santa Fe that turned quietly to nothing, and the silver remained in the vault under the Kettleman name until such use as Josiah Blake and a small committee of townsmen could put it to. Alice Fletcher took a room above the feed store for $2 a week, with a window that faced east toward the flats she had crossed. Ida Purcell, 61, the widow who ran the boarding kitchen, gave her a place at the long table without asking questions, and set down in front of her the first hot supper she had eaten since Reuben, which was pinto beans and shoulder of pork and cornbread cut in wedges from an iron pan. Amos Whitfield, 47, the smith, took her mule into his corral and reshod him without charge on the second day, saying only that the animal had carried her a long way and deserved better iron. Reverend Peter Coldwell, 52, walked her out to the little cemetery on the rise north of town and pointed to a plot of unbroken ground and said when the bones came in from the wash, the 3 men would be laid there under proper stones. and she was welcome to choose the words. And she chose for each of them the same words her mother had said, which were about the patient ground and the kind wind. Josiah Blake offered her a stool in the back of the assay office and taught her to read a beam scale to a quarter grain and to test a silver bar with acid on a black stone. And within a month she was keeping the Kettleman ledger in her own hand under his eye. And within 2 months she was signing receipts for small parcels on his authority when he was called away. She wrote to Ellen in Fort Purgatory a plain letter that said only that her uncle had loved her and had thought of her every day for 11 years. And she sent the letter with Josiah Blake and the first $1,000 of the gold. And Ellen wrote back a short letter in an 8-year-old's careful printing that Alice Fletcher folded and put into the oilcloth beside Amos Kettleman's letter and kept. By the end of her 3rd month in Coyote Ridge, people on the street spoke her name when they passed her. And Ida Purcell saved her the crust end of the cornbread. And Amos Whitfield tipped his hat. And children who had heard the story pointed at her from doorways until their mothers told them to stop. On an evening in the 4th month, Alice Fletcher climbed the outside stair to the room above the feed store and sat down on the edge of the cot with the window open to the east. The flats she had crossed lay out there under a lavender sky, and the dust of the day was settling, and the sound of the smith's hammer had gone quiet an hour before. On the little pine table she had bought for $1.40, she laid out the things that mattered. She laid out the brass pocket compass with the chipped glass and the needle that swung true. The compass Reuben had carried in his breast pocket for the better part of 40 years, and had put into her hand at the supper table when she was 15, and had said nothing at all in the giving of it. She laid it down carefully, opened the case, watched the needle settle north over the grain of the pine, and closed it again. Beside the compass, she laid the horn-handled pocket knife with the smooth, worn bone inlay that had belonged to Amos Kettleman, wagon master, 26 years on the southern freight roads, who had died with 3 of his men in a wash 2 days east of Coyote Ridge, and had thought, on his 2nd night out of Fort Purgatory, to write 4 pages in pencil on ruled ledger paper to whoever might come after. She set the knife an inch from the compass, so that the 2 objects lay together on the pine, and she looked at them a long time. 2 things from 2 men who had never met each other and would never meet her as she was now, and both of whom had, in their separate ways, refused to leave a girl with nothing. She thought of Reuben in the chair by the stove with the coffee gone cold in his hand, and she thought of Amos Kettleman riding by lantern light with his back against a wagon wheel, and she thought of Marcus Holloway in the black coat counting 11 silver dollars onto her own kitchen table for the mule she had raised from a foal. And she found that she could think of Marcus Holloway now without any anger, only with a small remote pity, because he had signed a paper for a plank house and a tobacco tin under a floorboard, and had believed he had taken everything of hers, and he had not. He had not taken the compass. He had not taken the 7 years of Reuben's teaching. He had not taken her steady hand or her eyes or her ability to read a track in the dust or a smell on the wind. He had not, in the end, taken anything that could not be replaced, and he had missed entirely the thing he could not have known was hers to find. Downstairs, Ida Purcell called up the stair that supper was on the table, and Alice Fletcher answered that she was coming. She stood at the window a moment longer. Below her, the street was almost empty. 2 men were walking home from the livery, and a dog was crossing at an angle, and a lamp was being lit in the window of the assay office where Josiah Blake sometimes worked late over the Kettleman ledger she had written in her own careful hand. She put the compass into the inner pocket of her coat, where it had ridden for 200 miles of flats and lava and caliche, and she put the horn-handled knife into the pocket beside it, and she went down to eat. Alice Fletcher was 18, and she had been turned out of the only home she had ever known with $11 folded into the lining of her coat, and she had spent those $11 on a sway-backed mule and a week of hardtack and ridden west because there was nowhere else to go. It was the best $11 she ever spent. If this story stayed with you, if you sat down inside it the way Alice Fletcher sat down at that pine table with her two small objects laid out in front of her. Take a moment now to subscribe and to share this story with someone who has been turned out of a place and told they had nothing left. Because those are the people who most need to hear how a girl with $11 and a brass compass crossed a set of flats and found a wagon in a wash and became, in the space of one honest season, the person a whole town greeted by name on the street. And before you go, sit with this question a little while. The way the narrator has been sitting with it. What has someone tried to take from you that they could not, in the end, actually take? And what did you carry out of that room in your coat pocket that turned out to be worth more than everything they thought they had kept? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're willing, what you carried out. We read everyone.